A single act of courage connected an old ranger and a wild bobcat, forging a silent bond that would end with an impossible surprise. The mountains of Colorado stood silent. They were vast and old. A call came over the radio. An animal was in trouble. The place was called Widow's Leap. It was a bad place, a dangerous ravine. In a land dry from drought, every day was a fight to live. Down in that ravine, a life was fading. An injured bobcat lay on a thin stone ledge. She was weak. She growled once, a low, frightened sound. Then she waited. Maybe she had fallen from the high rocks. She might have plunged into the narrow crack, into the cold, dark water below. By pure chance, a wildlife ranger named Arthur Finley was in the area that day. He heard a faint sound. It was the scrape of claws on rock. He followed the sound to the edge of the ravine. He looked down. What started as a simple rescue would become much more. It would become a bond, a connection that would fill the empty spaces in an old ranger's heart. It would lead to a surprise that proved saving one life could start a miracle you never saw coming. Arthur Finley sat on his porch. He was 62 years old. He watched the sun set. It painted the Colorado mountains in shades of orange and gold. Retirement was just months away. He had been a wildlife ranger for 40 years. 40 years had given him a lifetime of memories. But lately, they all felt distant. They were like old photographs fading in the sun. His wife, Clara, had passed away 3 winters ago. Since then, the silence in their small house was a heavy blanket. Even the wilderness, the place he loved most, felt empty without her. He sipped his morning coffee. He tried not to think about the quiet days that were coming. Soon he would hang up his uniform for the last time. What was a ranger without the wild to protect? The radio on his belt crackled. The sound cut through the quiet morning. "Art, you there? Got a report of an injured animal near Widow's Leap. Might be nothing, but you're the closest." Widow's Leap. Art knew the place well. It was a deep cut in the earth, a slash of granite where a creek had carved its path through stone. The drought had been cruel this year. Most streams and creeks were just dry, cracked beds of mud. The animals were getting desperate. They were taking risks they normally wouldn't. "On my way," he replied. His voice was gravelly. He was grateful for the call. It was a distraction from his own thoughts. The October morning was cold. Frost still clung to the long shadows. Art parked his truck and walked toward the ravine. He saw tracks in the dried mud near the edge, bobcat tracks. But something was wrong. One paw print was dragged, not placed. The animal's walk was uneven. A knot of concern tightened in his chest. In 4 decades, he had seen what desperation did to wildlife. It was a grim and predictable story. Then he heard it. The sound was so faint he almost missed it. It was not a mule. It was not a growl. It was the cry of something that had given up the fight. It was the sound of surrender. Art crept to the edge of the ravine and peered over. 20 feet down, a bobcat was wedged on a narrow ledge. The water of the creek rushed just below her. It was cold, fed by melting snow from the high peaks. Even from this distance, Art could see her ribs under her matted fur. She was weak. She was pressed against the rock wall as if she was trying to disappear into the stone itself. He knew he should call for backup. Protocol was clear. A wounded predator was unpredictable. But he looked at her half-closed eyes. He saw the slow rise and fall of her chest. He knew she didn't have time. The water was just above freezing. She was already shivering, a tremor that shook her thin body. Art had done plenty of foolish things in his career. His wife, Clara, had often called him an old fool with a loving smile. Climbing down a slick ravine toward a wounded bobcat would surely top the list. He started his descent. He tested each foothold, his old boots searching for a solid grip on the damp rock. He talked as he climbed, not to calm the cat, but to steady his own nerves. Clara would have my hide for this," he muttered to the wind. "She'd say I'm too old for this nonsense, and she'd probably be right." The bobcat's eyes opened fully as he got closer. She hissed. It was a weak, rattling sound. It was more reflex than threat. Her lips pulled back from her sharp teeth, but there was no energy behind the gesture. He was close enough now to see the gash on her hind leg. It was deep and still weeping blood. Seeing him there, so close, she simply closed her eyes again, as if the effort was too much. "I know," Art said softly. His voice was a low rumble. "You're scared. Me too." He slowly shrugged off his thick canvas jacket. He telegraphed every movement, making sure there were no surprises. The bobcat's amber eyes tracked him. Her pupils were wide with fear and pain. When he reached a hand toward her, she growled again, a low warning from deep in her chest. "Fair enough," Art said, pausing his movement. "But we both know you can't stay here. You'll freeze or starve." For a long, silent moment, they just looked at each other, the predator and the man. Both were breathing hard. Both were uncertain of what came next. Then something in her gaze shifted. It wasn't trust. Wild things didn't give trust easily. But perhaps it was recognition, a tired understanding that she had no other choices. This was her only chance. When Art carefully wrapped his jacket around her small body, she went stiff. But she didn't fight. She didn't struggle. Her claws pricked through the fabric of his sleeve as he lifted her. It wasn't an attack. It felt more like she was holding on. She weighed almost nothing. He wondered how long it had been since she'd had a successful hunt. The climb back up was treacherous. Art's arthritis, usually just a dull ache in the mornings, screamed in his knees and hands. His fingers were stiff with cold. Twice, his foot slipped on a loose patch of gravel. Both times, he felt the bobcat tense in his arms. But she didn't scratch or bite. She didn't try to escape. She had made her choice. Whatever happened now was better than dying alone in that cold, dark place. At the wildlife clinic, Dr. Erin Shaw took one look at the cat and shook her head. Erin was young, sharp, and practical. "Art, this cat is hanging on by a thread," she said, her expression serious. "She's severely malnourished and dehydrated. The leg is infected. I'd say she has a 30% chance, and that's being optimistic." Art said, "She climbed out of that ravine with me." His voice was firm. He looked at the small, still form on the examination table. "That has to count for something." As Erin and her team went to work, cleaning the wound and starting an IV, Art found himself thinking about second chances. He remembered the sterile white room where he and Clara had gotten her diagnosis. He remembered the doctor talking about percentages and probabilities. He remembered how Clara had squeezed his hand and said with a strength that amazed him, "Well, let's see what we can do with the time we have." "I don't have to stay, Art," Dr. Shaw said gently, noticing him standing quietly in the corner of the room. "I'll stay." And he did. In the days that followed, Art established a new routine. He would do his morning patrol, checking on the deer herds and the water levels in the lower streams. Then he would drive to the clinic. He would pull a plastic chair up outside the bobcat's enclosure. He sat far enough away not to stress her, but close enough that she knew he was there. He didn't try to talk to her or interact. He just sat. Sometimes he would read an old paperback. Sometimes he would just watch her. The staff had started calling the bobcat Willow. The name seemed to fit her. She was thin and fragile, but she had a strength that bent without breaking. Willow remained wary.
when a vet tech approached with food or medicine, she would press herself into the far corner of her cage, her eyes wide with alarm. But with Art, something was different. She still kept her distance, but she had stopped hiding when he arrived. She would lie on her blanket, watching him with a steady, unblinking gaze. It was small progress, but it was progress. 2 weeks into her recovery, Art was sitting in his usual spot, reading a report on elk migration patterns. He noticed movement out of his corner of his eye. Willow had crept from her bed to the front of her enclosure. She wasn't approaching him, but she was no longer huddled in the back. She was watching him, her amber eyes filled with a quiet intelligence. "Morning," Art said, keeping his voice low. He knew that direct eye contact could be seen as a threat by a wild animal.
Willow's ear twitched at the sound of his voice. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she made a sound. It was a soft chirp, almost like a question. It was a sound he had never heard from her before. Art's hand stilled on the papers in his lap, but he kept his gaze down. "Yeah, it's a nice morning," he said, his voice conversational and calm. "Supposed to snow later, though." They sat that way for nearly an hour. The old ranger pretending to read his reports, the recovering bobcat pretending not to watch him. A silent understanding was growing between them. It became their ritual. As Willow gained strength, the question of her future came up. Her leg was healing well, but the months of starvation had taken a toll on her body. Dr. Shaw was concerned about her ability to hunt effectively in the wild, especially with the ongoing drought. "There's the sanctuary," she suggested during a staff meeting. The sanctuary was a large, protected piece of land for animals that couldn't be returned to the wild. "It's not ideal. Bobcats are solitary and need a lot of territory, but it's better than—" She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the room knew what she meant. It was better than starving. It was better than dying. In a world where the drought had tipped the balance so heavily against predators. Art helped prepare a section of the sanctuary for Willow. He made sure she had a small man-made cave for shelter. He helped build elevated rock platforms where she could survey her territory. They made sure she would have access to live prey to keep her hunting skills sharp. He wanted her to have the best possible life. The day of her transfer, Willow surprised everyone. As the team prepared a sedative to make the transport easier, she stood up, walked calmly to the open door of the transfer crate, and went inside on her own. She looked back once. Her gaze found Art among the group of staff members. Then she turned and faced forward, ready for the next chapter. "Well, I'll be damned," Dr. Shaw murmured, watching in disbelief. "It's like she understands." At the sanctuary, Willow adapted faster than anyone expected. She immediately began to explore her new spacious enclosure. She marked her boundaries and investigated every rock and tree. Art visited twice a week. He always sat on the same wooden bench, a good distance from her fence. He respected her wildness. He just wanted to see that she was okay. He watched as she regained the fluid, silent grace of a healthy predator. One winter afternoon in December, Art arrived to find another bobcat in the enclosure next to Willow's. "That's Leo," Dr. Shaw explained when she saw him. "He's a male, lost partial sight in one eye after being hit by a car. He can't hunt well enough to survive on his own." She added quickly, "We're not planning on introducing them. Bobcats are solitary and need a lot of territory, but sometimes they surprise us." Willow noticed Leo immediately. Art expected her to be hostile, to show territorial aggression. Instead, she seemed curious. Over the next few weeks, Art watched them. They would often sit near the fence that separated them, watching each other. They were cautious and wary, but there was an undeniable interest.
Finally, the sanctuary staff decided to try letting them share the larger territory. Art held his breath on the day they opened the gate between the two enclosures. The two cats circled each other for hours. They moved slowly, reading each other's body language, establishing personal space. Then Leo did something completely unexpected. He had caught a rabbit earlier that day. He picked it up, carried it to a neutral spot between them, and laid it down. Then he backed away, giving her space. Willow approached the offering slowly. She sniffed the rabbit. She looked at Leo, who sat watching her from a distance. Then she did something that made Art's eyes well up with tears. She began to eat. But she positioned her body so that Leo could approach and share the meal if he chose. They fed together, two solitary predators sharing a meal in the winter sun. Winter deepened. The snow fell, covering the mountains in a thick white blanket. Art's visits to the sanctuary became moments of quiet reflection for him. He watched Willow thrive. He saw her form this strange, unexpected bond with Leo. It reminded him that life always found a way to continue, even after a great loss.
He thought of Clara. She would have loved this story. She would have teased him gently about getting sentimental over a wild cat. The thought brought a sad smile to his face. In late February, during one of his visits, Art noticed that Willow was moving differently. She was more careful, more deliberate in her steps. Her belly, he thought, looked slightly rounded. He didn't dare to hope. It seemed impossible. But when Dr. Shaw called him a week later to confirm that Willow was pregnant, he felt something warm and hopeful shift in his chest. New life, born against all odds. The final weeks of winter were tense. Willow grew more reclusive. She spent her days preparing several different dens, lining them with dry grass and leaves. Leo's behavior was also unusual for a male bobcat. He stayed nearby, a silent guardian. He never got too close to her chosen den, but he was always there, patrolling the perimeter. Art found himself checking his phone constantly, waiting for news. The call came on a raw, cold morning in March. "She's in labor," Dr. Shaw said over the phone. Her voice was excited. "I thought you'd want to know." Art drove to the sanctuary through a swirl of late-season snow. His old hands were tight on the steering wheel. In the observation building, a small group of staff members watched the monitors. Cameras were trained on the entrance to Willow's den. For hours there was nothing but the quiet image of the snow-dusted rocks. Then, carried on the wind, they heard it. A thin, high-pitched cry of new life. "One," Dr. Shaw breathed, her eyes glued to the screen. A few minutes later, another cry. 2. Then another. 3. By evening, 5 kittens had been born. 5 tiny, blind miracles, born to a mother who had nearly died in a cold ravine just a few months before. In the days that followed, Art maintained his distance more than ever. He knew that Willow needed space and quiet. She needed to bond with her kittens. She needed to be the fierce, protective mother that nature intended her to be. He watched them through the cameras in the observation building. He saw her nursing them, cleaning them, and guarding them with a primal, powerful intensity. Then, 2 weeks later, something extraordinary happened. Art was sitting on his usual bench. It was a clear, cold day. The sun was bright on the snow. He was far from Willow's den, just watching the mountains. He saw movement near the rocks. It was Willow. She emerged from the den with a tiny kitten held gently in her mouth. Art's heart began to race. Was she moving them? Was something wrong? She walked carefully across the snow and placed the kitten in a patch of sunlight. The spot was about 50 feet from Art's bench. It was far enough to be safe, but close enough for him to see. Then she turned and went back to the den. She returned with another kitten. One by one, she brought all 5 of her babies out. She arranged them in the warm sunlight like precious jewels. Art hardly dared to breathe. He sat perfectly still. Willow settled down near her babies. She looked across the snow-covered ground, her amber eyes finding his. She didn't approach him. She didn't make a sound, but she was sharing this moment with him. She was showing him the new life that his single act of kindness had made possible. They stayed that way for 20 minutes. The old ranger on his bench, the mother bobcat with her kittens, a silent connection that transcended species. Then, as naturally as she had brought them out, Willow began to gather her babies. She carried them one by one back to the safety of the den. Art sat there on the bench long after they were gone. The air was cold, and tears were freezing on his old, weathered cheeks. He had thought he was just doing his job that day at Widow's Leap, but Willow had given him something profound in return. She had given him a reminder that life persists, that connections can form in the most unexpected ways, that even in the midst of loss and loneliness, there could be moments of pure, astonishing grace. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and bringing green shoots to the mountain meadows. The kittens grew bold. Art watched them on his visits. He saw their personalities develop. One was adventurous and always straying too far. Another was cautious and shy. Each was unique.
Willow remained a protective mother, but she continued her ritual. During Art's visits, she would bring the kittens into view, always at a safe distance, always wild. But it was her way of acknowledging the role he had played in their existence. On his last day before retirement, Art sat on his bench one final time. His uniform felt heavy. The kittens were nearly grown now. They were learning to hunt, pouncing on grasshoppers and chasing each other through the tall grass. Willow was lounging on a high rock, surveying her territory like a queen. Leo patrolled nearby, a watchful shadow. As Art stood up to leave, Willow rose too. She looked at him across the space that had always separated them. It was the necessary distance between the wild world and the human one. Then she did something he had never seen before. She blinked at him. It was a slow, deliberate blink. Once, then twice. In the silent language of cats, it was the ultimate expression of contentment. It was a sign of trust. Art's throat felt tight. He blinked back at her slowly. Then Willow turned. She melted into the brush, her family following her like a stream of liquid gold. Driving home, Art thought about the invisible threads that connect all lives. A desperate cry from a ravine, a choice to climb down a dangerous cliff, a wild creature's decision to accept help. And from that single moment, a chain of events had led to 5 new lives exploring the world. He pulled into his driveway. His empty house waited for him. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel quite so empty. The silence didn't feel so heavy. Tomorrow he would return to the sanctuary, not as a ranger, but as a volunteer. Willow would keep her distance, as she should. She and her family belonged to the wild, but she would be there. She was living proof that sometimes saving one life could ripple outward in ways you never expected. The surprise she had given him wasn't just her kittens, it wasn't just her own survival. It was the reminder that even in the twilight of his own journey, he could still make a difference. It was knowing that connections, forged in the most unlikely circumstances, could fill the empty spaces in a lonely heart. As the first stars began to appear in the deep blue sky over the mountains, Arthur Finley smiled.
Somewhere out there in the sanctuary, a bobcat mother was teaching her young to hunt, and an old ranger had found a reason to keep showing up, to keep caring, to keep believing in the endless, stubborn resilience of life. Clara would have loved this story, and in sharing it with him, Willow had given Art something precious. It wasn't just a memory, it was a future. It was a reason to wake up tomorrow, drive to the sanctuary, and sit on that bench. It was a reason to be part of something larger than his own grief. Wild things didn't trust easily, but sometimes they remembered. And sometimes that was more than enough.